Earlier this year, I spent a couple of weeks in Costa Rica with the Canon R5c, which was long overdue for me. I've been wanting to try this camera for a long time, so I was finally able to get a loaner from Canon, and I spent the couple of weeks, like I said, down in Costa Rica, traveling all over the country from the Osa Peninsula on some back roads in the middle of nowhere to the Caribbean lowlands and everywhere in between in the cloud forest and so on. So in this video, I'm just going to do a quick recap of everything that we saw, the places we went, and talk a little bit about my experience with the R5c. This isn't meant to be a super technical review per se. There's plenty of those out here on YouTube. I just kind of want to talk about a lot of the things that I liked and again, my experience with this camera. One of the main target species that we were after was the resplendent quetzal, which is one of the most famous birds in Costa Rica because of their long, beautiful tails. If you're not familiar with this, you've probably seen shots of this, I'm sure. But there's only really two areas to get these up in the cloud forest. And unfortunately, the main nest that we were here to photograph, one of the nights, a couple nights before we got there, something ate the female and the eggs, and unfortunately that nest failed. So our guide had found a new nest, but to get there was a little bit of an adventure. We were literally hacking this trail to get out to where they were, putting down logs to kind of make bridges over the creeks and things like that, and using some fallen trees to kind of navigate some of the bigger stretches of the creeks to get to the nest. But all in all, it was nice because it was, this was as remote as it gets. And we were able to set up here and get a lot of different shots of the female leaving the nest, the male coming in, and some flight shots and some things like that. So right away, what I noticed was when setting up the R5c, when switching over from photo to video, it didn't have the button like I'm used to with the original R5. It has a switch, which to me is an unfortunate thing because even the R5 II, the R3, the R1, they all have that switch now. I really did like the button switch better because it was easy to go on the fly just to switch from video to, or from photos to video and back and forth really quickly if you're trying to do both. Not the end of the world, but again, I don't want to start this off with a negative, but that was one of the things I noticed right away. One of our next stops would be up into the Caribbean lowlands where we would go for the king vultures in these hides. And here I was shooting a lot more hybrid situations, a lot of back and forth between photos and videos. And what I noticed is with the R5c, if you're used to coming from an R5, it's going to be a lot different. You're going to have a full cinema menu. The autofocus in the video is not the same focus that's in the video for the original R5. It is different. This is more of a, I don't want to say professional, but for lack of a better term, professional, quote unquote, video camera. So it's definitely suited better to manual focusing, which is what most cinema camera rigs are. Whereas, if you switch over to photos, it does have the full R5 autofocus system in it. It functions just like the R5 as far as photos go. It has the 45 megapixel sensor. The images are super sharp, clean. You can crop all day with the 45 megapixels. But again, switching over to video, it's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period, I think, for a lot of people. But that said, the video looks fantastic, and it's got a lot more different codecs, different formats that you can shoot in that are a little bit more, again, for lack of a better term, quote unquote, professional. So the week that we were here was probably the hottest that I've ever been in my life. It was unbelievably hot. And one thing was my original R5 actually overheated one of the days before I even took one clip. It was just that hot out. Whereas the R5c with the built-in vents, phenomenal. Never overheated once on me. The fan noise was never an issue. I've heard some people complain about that. I did not have an issue with that. This camera performed great. And when we were in the Osa Peninsula, we went across one of these suspended bridges, which it takes a lot to get me over one of those. I have a major heights thing, especially, structures in the rainforest. But the one thing that'll get me to go over it is owls every time. And we had an unbelievable morning with these spectacled owls, which was a new one for me. Really awesome to see them, especially with owlets. So again, to get me over one of the bridges, it was worth it. But and even being out here in the dark rainforest, R5c performed great. And speaking of dark, one of the nights we actually went out to photograph bats that were coming to feed on these plants. And I used the R5c again for this, as well as the R3. But honestly, I didn't really see any difference between the two. They both worked, again, wonderfully. I was able to get a lot of shots. We were using remote triggers to fire. flashes as they would come up to feed. And again, you know, basically being an R5, which I've been using for a very long time, I had no issues. So who's this camera for, and should you get this over an R5 II? For me personally, I think if you're committed to shooting with more of a rig style, you know, putting a monitor on, putting bigger batteries, because that was one thing I didn't talk about. Battery life is not that great, but I wouldn't expect it to be unless you had a grip or an external battery. Then it would be a different story. So again, if you're committed to shooting, I'm using that term again, but professional video and in a rig type, I would take the R5c every time over the R5 or the R5 II. If you want to be more of a hybrid shooter that you're only shooting on it for social media, go for the R5 II. It's just going to be easier. The autofocus is going to be better, and you don't need all the extra bells and whistles of the professional video. With all of that said, I absolutely love my time with the R5c. I think this is the perfect camera for somebody that's like me, that does sell video to things like documentaries and things like that for major network television. But I also can't give up photography. I'm still a photographer at heart. So to me, this is the perfect all-in-one solution. I'm really hoping they continue this with perhaps like an R5C2 with a couple slight upgrades on some things like autofocus and stuff like that would be great. But all in all, I would buy this camera with no regrets, in a heartbeat. Again, over an R5 II, being someone that does more commercial video work. So I'll leave you with some clips that I shot. Hope you enjoyed this video. You know, I hope it's entertaining, or at least helps if you're thinking about getting one of these. And I'll see you in the next one.